Corinthians 15. I can say it in less than 10 minutes. There you go. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you this morning. Good to be here this morning. Today is starting a little bit different time, Margaret Street, because this morning the church plant group is going to start meeting on Sunday mornings and start organizing and having studies to get prepared for the church plant to be whenever they go in January, as well as the idea behind this is that they are no longer going to be participants in Sunday morning Bible class hour. And so we can't rely on them for being teachers in the different classes. It's basically starting to begin a little bit of that separation point so that we can see how the congregations are going to work independently, because that's what we're going to be exactly in January. So with that being said, we're starting a new study. This Sunday morning we're going to study the life of Christ here in the auditorium. And what we're going to do in that, I'll explain a little bit more as we go through, but what we're going to do is go through the life of Christ in chronological order. You know, many times we study Matthew, and then we'll study Mark, and then Luke, and then John, and they all four tell the same story, but sometimes if you look at things in a chronological order, you get a little bit more information. How many of you have read the Bible in chronological order? 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 or 6 of us. Say again? Oh, up here's a hand too. Chronological order is simply putting all of the different events in their order. How many of you know that the Bible is not written in chronological order? Good, that's good. In fact, how many of you know that some of the books, is that rain? Wow. The books themselves, a lot of times, are not written in chronological order. Okay, great. And that's a big thing to understand. A lot of people, especially new to Bible study, do not understand that the Bible is not written from cover to cover in chronological order, and sometimes not even the books themselves are written in chronological order, and it can confuse people sometimes, especially when you get into Old Testament history and get into the divided kingdom and things like that. Well, the same is true for the life of Christ. And one of the great examples that always comes to mind to give you a reason why it's so important to study in chronological order from time to time is Matthew 23 and 24. How many of you know what's in Matthew 23 and 24? What's the main topic? Somebody remember? The end of times. You remember that study? Remember that conversation that Jesus says that I tell you that not one stone shall be left upon the other. And so his disciples then ask him about that. And then what do we have? You go through and he starts explaining all these things are going to happen, and lots of false doctrines were born out of people trying to interpret Matthew 23 and 24. Well, if you just go over to Luke and look at the parallel text, a lot of those questions are answered and refuted. And so it's real easy sometimes to make things a little more clear when you put them in chronological order. That's just one reason. There's lots of other reasons for that. So we're going to have a study on the life of Christ, and to cover Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is not something you're going to do in 13 weeks. So this study is probably going to last for right at a year. And so that's what we're going to try to do, is go through there, and we're going to explain a little bit more as we're moving through. Let's start with a prayer, however. So if I could, Brother Bob, would you mind leading us in a prayer? Amen. All right, let's see if we can advance this. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to study the life of Christ, the gospel accounts, a harmony of the gospel. How many are familiar with the harmony of the gospels? A lot of your Bibles will have that in the back there. Many of your Bibles have a harmony of the gospels. Okay, so that's essentially what we're going to do, is we're going to go down through this harmony of the Gospels through the various events and look at all the text. Now, if the text is identical in one area, then we'll just identify that. We won't read every single text that goes through, but we are going to follow through depending on where we're at within the four gospel accounts. And so it presents Christ in a little bit different perspective than how we usually study about him and his life. And it makes a difference in a lot of the events, especially, I believe, when you get into the Passion Week. I call it the Passion Week, his last week. There's some events that happen there that can become quite confusing if you're not following in that chronological order. So hopefully that's going to clarify that. So this study is going to cover that. But before we begin, we're going to back up a little bit and look at time a little bit before that. Let's start by looking at John 20, verse 31. And then if I could also have somebody ready to read Galatians 4:4. John 20, verse 31. If somebody could read that for us, I'd greatly appreciate it. So these things are written, John says. We can include in that the entire Bible. The entire Bible is about Jesus Christ. A lot of people don't recognize that, including the Old Testament. You can find Jesus Christ on every single page of the Bible. And I'd be happy to sit down and show you that. In fact, we might have a study. It's the Messiahship study. It's a great look at how Jesus is presented throughout the entire Bible. But especially when you get in the New Testament, we now have these things that are written about him. And so again, it makes sense to look at this in a chronological view. You go to 2 Timothy 1, 8 through 13, Paul talks about being appointed a minister, appointed an evangelist, a gospel preacher. And then we have these things so that we might believe. And he talks about how it was done before time. Okay? Thinking about that, go now to Galatians 4, verse 4. And really, this is the key verse for today and for our study that this day and the next study that we're going to have. Galatians 4:4. What does it say?
But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons.
Perfect. So the first key words there, what does it say? When the fullness of time. Have you ever asked yourself, why did Jesus come when he came? Why did he come at that particular time? Why doesn't he come today? Why didn't he come years before that? Why didn't he come 1,000 years ago? Have you ever asked that question? Have you ever thought about that? Why did he come when he came? And so that's what we're going to look at as far as this. We're going to need to back up before we go forward. Have you ever also asked the question of, when we're reading through the New Testament, we're reading through these gospel accounts, all of a sudden there's these people called Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians and things. Where did they come from? Has everybody asked that question? Where did they come from? Or, who is Herod? How did he get to where he is? What do you mean King Herod? How did he get to be a king? I thought the last king was deported, into captivity. You think about the end of the Old Testament where the story stops, and then all of a sudden we have this basically 400 years of silence. So this is called the intertestamental period, and that's what I mean by we're going to back up just a little bit before we go forward into the gospel accounts, because there's information here that is essential, that is crucial in understanding not only the New Testament text, but the Bible in general. And if you've never done a study on the intertestamental period, it's one that will certainly strengthen your faith and give you a better understanding of the New Testament. Not only that, but if we look at this, it will help us understand even more about the prophecies of the Old Testament. Because some of the prophecies that Daniel and Isaiah and others gave were fulfilled during this intertestamental period. How many of you ever studied the intertestamental period? 2, 3. Good. All right, so it looks like this is going to be a good class for everybody to learn, because there's a lot of great information. So I'd like to encourage you to take notes because a lot of this information is going to be useful for your future Bible study. So what is the intertestamental period? As it says on the screen, can everybody read the screen okay? All right, I need to know, because if not, I'll make the fonts bigger, because I need you to be able to read. So just let me know, Troy, that, it could be a little bit bigger. So it's a time that's unwritten between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. It is approximately 400 years of prophetic silence. The reason we say that is because God basically stopped his communication. It's the time between the last communication from God to man until the events of the gospel account. And we're going to look at this in more detail. But you have your last prophet, and then God doesn't speak through prophets or anybody else until we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's also the time that God sets the stage for the coming of Jesus Christ and the spread of the gospel to the whole world. That whole verse, whenever the fullness of time, you understand that word fullness, everything is complete. When the completeness of time had arrived, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. That entire verse has so much weight to it. You could spend an entire gospel meeting on just that one verse. And so there's a lot of information there. And that's what we want to hopefully help you understand. So moving forward, and just a little graphic here. This is one of my favorite tools that I have. It's called the Kings and Prophets chart. And different Bibles have these in the back of them. Or if you would like a copy of this, I'll certainly be glad to get you a copy of it. It just helps me, as we talked about earlier, helps me see that the Bible being not written in chronological order, we Americans typically like things in order, and we want to know where things fall. And it helps us to place different prophets and things that happen. So this Kings and Prophets chart, if you see here, you have here is Saul, David, and Solomon. This is the United Kingdom, and I know most of you are familiar with this. And so then you have the divided kingdom whenever they divide into Israel and Judah, story that most of us are familiar with. But then what is really useful about this chart is where all of the prophets fit into that story. And we have Isaiah written before some of the others, and then we have some of these other ones that are located in the Old Testament before the others. But this shows where they were in time, also showing where they were in region. For example, you have Jonah up here and Hosea up above prophesying to Israel, whereas you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the others prophesying to Judah. As well as when you get into this area, look how many prophets there are just in this one area. Those are all the prophets that appeared, that God sent during the time of the end of the southern kingdom of Judah and when they were going into captivity. So if I zoom in on this a little bit, come up a little bit closer to that last part, these last few years, you see right here about 390 BC, this is that intertestamental period that we're talking about. So when Malachi, being the last prophet, closes his book, sets down his pen, it's the last time we hear from God until we get into the New Testament. So in order to see this and understand what all this is coming from, we're going to start by dividing this into two different sections. The first is going to be the world powers, and this is very important to understand as we look at the Old Testament. Now, I keep saying this intertestamental period is 400 years of silence, and we're going to study about this. And so maybe the question is, okay, well, if God was silent, where did the information come from? How do we know anything about this 400 years of silence? Well, we know about it because we have certain writings that we can look back and certain historical documents that we can examine. And those are, some of you heard of the Apocrypha? Okay, what's the Apocrypha? It's part of the Catholic Bible. They are books that were written by Jewish rabbis during this period. They are uninspired, and they're kind of like an appendix to the Old Testament. And they contain some information that we're going to look at, like the Maccabees. You've heard of the Maccabees? So it has some of that information in it and a little bit other information that we can use, as well as there were the writings of a historian by the name of Josephus. You've heard of that name. Josephus gives us a lot of information. He was a Jewish historian who wrote down a lot of things that happened to the Jews and the different wars that happened, as well as a lot of Greek and Roman writers. So the information is there. And so the things I'm going to be presenting come from historical documents. And we're going to see how those are connected with the Bible. So starting out, if we go to let's go ahead and go to the end of the Bible. Let's go to the Bible that we have. It's not actually the end of the Hebrew Bible, but it's the last prophet that we have. And if we look at those last verses, Malachi 4, 5, and 6, and if somebody would read those for us.
Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. He shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse.
Now, those of you who have studied your Bibles, what is this a reference to? What is this going to be leading to? John the Baptist, and then it carries on beyond that. And so that's the last thing. So God says, I've done all these things. They've been carried off into captivity. He has now spread the Hebrew people all over different areas. And then he says, that's it. And then there's going to be somebody who's going to come, Elijah, who's going to announce. And that's when we see the opening of the New Testament. But way before this, all the way back, even before even started this idea of captivity, he was already warning the people of what's going to happen and letting the people know there was something bigger was going to come. And so if we go to Daniel 2:44, Daniel 2:44 is one of these prophecies that we're going to see unfold during this intertestamental period. Daniel 2:44. Does somebody have that? Daniel 2, verse 44.
And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever.
Okay. Hear the words. In the days of these kings. Now, this is a summary of Daniel. Some of you might remember this story. You remember the story of Daniel? Whenever he was carried off to captivity, him and his friends were young men, and the king, who's the king? Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia has this dream, and I love this story because he says, I need my magicians and everybody to come and tell me this dream. And he doesn't give them any clues up front, and he kind of calls them out because it proves that they don't really know what they're talking about whenever they try to interpret this dream. And then kind of just out of casual happenstance, somebody remembers Daniel and says, well, hey, this guy could probably do it. And what's the first thing he did? He went to God and asked to God for God to give him help and wisdom. And God then provided. And he even gives God the glory when he goes to Nebuchadnezzar. And what is the dream? He says to Nebuchadnezzar, I love this part, before Nebuchadnezzar even says anything to him, I know your dream is this big statue. Can you imagine how Nebuchadnezzar must have felt? Wow, he already knows what it's about. And then starts explaining, so he has this big statue. You remember that story? And he divides it into the 4 different parts. The gold part of the head, the breastplate and area is silver, and then the loins were bronze, and then metal were the legs. Do you remember that prophecy? Is everybody with me so far? That's this verse now. When you get to 2:44, he says, these are these different kings. They represent different kingdoms. The first one is your kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar, this gold. And it is the Babylonian Empire. But there's going to be another kingdom that comes after that. That's represented by the silver. And then after that, another kingdom. And then after that, another kingdom. What he doesn't tell him is who those kingdoms are exactly. However, we're going to see that history plays out exactly the way that Daniel said it was going to, and he even mentions one of those kingdoms later on in further prophecy that he receives. And so that's what leads to this Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time. Once again, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So we're looking forward to something that's going to happen. And this also explains a lot of the misunderstanding that we see in the New Testament by the disciples and the Pharisees and everybody who did not quite understand what it was that God was doing until after Jesus was raised from the dead. So, let's look at these kingdoms that we have. Let's back up just a little bit more before we jump into the Persian period. So we know about Babylon. If we're in Babylon, you know the story of how Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came and destroyed Jerusalem. Who was before Babylon? Who do we have? What kingdom came and carried away Israel into captivity? The Assyrians. So we have the Assyrians. So what we have are these world powers. Assyria comes down, carries away Israel into captivity, and were quite cruel in what they did. They carried the Hebrew people up into that Babylonian area, Mesopotamia. Well, then Nebuchadnezzar comes along. We read about this in the Old Testament. He comes along and he conquers Assyria. Remember that story? And then he comes down, and in 4 different phases, essentially, he carries the rest of Israel and Judah off into captivity, and eventually destroys the temple and Jerusalem. Is everybody with me? And everybody remember that part of the Old Testament? That's a whole other study. And be glad to study that with you if you haven't. So just let me know. But that's the end of where we're at in the Old Testament. Then what happens? Nebuchadnezzar becomes king. They're carried off. Then how long are they in captivity, approximately? Does anybody remember? 70 years. 70 years. What happens at the end of 70 years? The Persians, another world kingdom, comes in and conquers Nebuchadnezzar. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's already dead, but he conquers the Babylonian Empire. And now what does the Persian king do? Another famous story in the Old Testament. What does the Persian king do? A famous Persian king who was prophesied about. Cyrus. You remember that story? In Isaiah 44, 45, he names this king who's going to let his people go. I love the Bible, and I'm amazed that, how many was that? 300-400 years before. Can you imagine this king sitting there, and all of a sudden here come these Hebrew people and say, King Cyrus, we want to show you something that was written about you 400 years ago. Amazing. So what did King Cyrus do? He allowed them to go back to Jerusalem. He allowed the Jews to go back to their homelands. In fact, there's even a little cylinder that they have found, because they used to record things in clay tablets and things like that. It's called the Cyrus cylinder, and it talks about that return that was allowed for the Hebrew people. So what we have is this new kingdom, the Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians, that have a little bit different. They were a lot more tolerant of the customs of the Jews and other ethnicities, and allowed considerable freedom. They allowed the Jewish nation to return. See, they were just the opposite. What happened was the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, they took the people and transplanted them into their lands, and then sent back their people to live in the lands where they'd been conquered. Well, the Persians were just the opposite. They allowed them to stay where they are, and then just have to pay tribute, as well as be put underneath a Persian governor. And so we have this new empire that comes out, and they are allowed to return. And so at the closing of the Old Testament, we have these prophets, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, who talk about this return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple and of the walls. Hopefully you remember all those stories and wonderful stories about the return, and how some people who were there during the captivity, the older people, remembered how the old temple looked like, and they cried, they wept. And one side, I think they were weeping because of what they remembered, and then the other side, they were weeping of joy because of seeing the Lord's temple being rebuilt. Here's a map of the Persian Empire, just to show you how big of an area we're talking about. Some of you, if you're familiar, this is Israel, and that area right there, Palestine. Here you have Egypt. And so the Persian Empire went all the way back over to India, and extended over into what's modern-day Turkey and almost into Greece. So a huge amount of space. In fact, many of you, if you've studied, this is called the Fertile Crescent. And Palestine is a land bridge. And that's why Palestine, it's interesting how God situated his people in such an interesting place, because these world powers that were vying for each other had to pass through Palestine. So they're always going to be affected by these changes in world powers. So what we have here is the Persian Empire. And during this time that he allowed them to go, the Persian kings allowed them to go back into Palestine, you have the Hebrew people, God's people, the Jews, coming back into their land, and all of a sudden tensions are developing from the people who were living there now, who had intermarried with people who had stayed behind. If you remember the story of captivity, they didn't take all of the people into captivity. They left the poor people behind, those who could work the fields, and then they transplanted, the Babylonians transplanted people into those areas. So now they have intermarried. So you have this mixed race. Well, if you're a pure Jew, Jewish descent, then that's where some of these tensions come from, and they settled in a land called Samaria. Hopefully, as I'm telling you these things, you're going to be thinking about some of the stories of the New Testament and going, oh, that's why they got so upset. And that's why they didn't want to go through Samaria. Samaria, remember that most of the Jewish people wouldn't even go through Samaria. If they wanted to go from Jerusalem to Galilee, they would go around. That'd be like if we want to go to South Carolina or something and we didn't want to travel through Georgia, we go all the way around to get up there. That's the exact same thing that's happening. Now the Samaritans, those of the mixed race, they started mixing the worship of Yahweh God with their pagan deities. Okay, and this is not uncommon to, or not unreasonable when you think about it. You have these poor Jewish people behind, and now you have all these new people coming in, and they're going to bring their deities and stuff. And a lot of times, we don't realize the effect that has. You know, we're having these Wednesday night studies on culture and worldview. Well, it affects us in many different ways. And in this case, you have a whole new culture, a whole new worldview coming in. And imagine you're this poor Hebrew farmer, and you're doing everything you can to raise your crops. But you look over here at your neighbor, this Babylonian, and all of a sudden his crops are way bigger and much more harvest. And you're thinking, what's he doing different than I'm doing? And so you talk to your neighbor, how'd you get so much corn? And he says, well, you know, I pray to the God of Baal, you know, the God of rain. We need rain, and so I pray to Baal, and he sends rain, and I have big crops. And to somebody who's not very strong in their faith, that's going to have an effect on them. And so therefore you start mixing. They didn't do away with the worship of God. They just started mixing that in. And so that's a big problem whenever Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman, and he says to her, or she says to him, you think the only place you can worship is in Jerusalem. And what does he say? He explains to her, well, you're mistaken in your theology and where your understanding of where God actually is. So the Jews were waiting also for the promised Messiah. The mixed races in Samaria didn't have that same thing. That's why the Samaritan woman was so excited, because she did have that information. Remember what happened? She went back to tell all of her people, all of her, this word, compatriota is the word I was struggling with the other day. What do you call that? Your fellow citizens, your fellow, what's that? What do you say? Samarianites, exactly. Over in the town. So all of the people in a town to come and see the Christ. And so, okay. So what we have here is we have these stories of everything coming back. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, as I mentioned, telling of the return of the captivity. Wonderful, exciting, interesting stories. And then we have that story of Esther, which is very interesting, where she is made queen of Persia. That happened about 478 BC. So when the Old Testament closes with the book of Malachi, we know what's happening with God's people, that Judea was a Persian province. And that's where it stops. So the next question is, what happens? Between that point until we get to John the Baptist, what happens? Well, first thing we know, that the Persian providence remained for about another 100 years, up until about 332 BC. And then what happened? Alexander the Great, exactly. What's that?
What time? What time put him in there? What, clean up all that work?
He did, exactly. At 20 years of age, he becomes the king of Greece, if you will, assumes authority of Greece, and like a meteor takes off, conquering lands all the way to Egypt, all the way down to, I said Egypt, all the way to India, and then all the way down to Egypt. He took his army, and he spent some time going into Palestine, where he battled against Tyre and then Gaza for about a year. And then by the time he gets down to Egypt, he walks into Egypt. They were excited to see Alexander the Great because of the Persian rule that they had been under. They, in fact, considered Alexander a god and gave him the name of a god. So it really opened up the door to his empire going in every which direction. So due to its influence, see, Alexander the Great was a student, and if I think I got this right, he's a student of Aristotle. And so he had this Greek influence, and he took that Greek culture and spread it all over the world. Once again, instead of conquering people, sending them back to the home country, they let them stay where they were, but they had to assimilate into this Greek culture. So now all of a sudden we have a universal language. So all the way from Greece to India, all the way down through Palestine to Egypt, everybody starts speaking the same language. Could you imagine something like that happening, where all of a sudden, where all the way, because really pretty much all of South America speaks Spanish. Then you come up into Central America, they speak Spanish. And then you get into these people who don't speak Spanish, and then there's people who speak French. What if all of a sudden the whole thing spread into Spanish? If all of America and Canada and everybody speaking Spanish, you would be speaking Spanish from Canada all the way down to the tip of South America. I know you're thinking, wait a minute, what about English? Well, Spanish was already there, so that's the only reason I used that one. But could you imagine being able to travel all the way from Canada through the United States, Mexico, to the tip of South America, speaking one language? Now, there's going to be different dialects, but the same language. That's what we have now all of a sudden. It had never been that way before. Folks, what we have here is the world is changing. God is working behind the scenes here, and He is preparing the way for His Son. And what is one of the ways that you can transmit language? And so if everybody can understand one another, and the writings understand, so now we have a big part of the prophecies that are starting to be fulfilled. So the prophecy of Daniel is beginning to unfold here. We're going to look at that in just a second. So he assumed control of Jerusalem whenever he goes down into Egypt. Here you can see that Grecian Empire, so stretching now, including Greece, all the way over into India and way down into Egypt. And so we have this Greek Empire. Now, unfortunately, he didn't last very long. He didn't live very long. Alexander gave special privileges to the Jews, by the way. He said, I used them as settlers, persuading them to settle in vast regions of the empire. Now, let me explain something. You have all these people, let's back up just a bit, all these people taken into captivity to Babylonia. They're there for 70-something years. Is that a short amount of time or a long amount of time? Or depends on how old you are. Okay. That's just true. But for your personal lifetime, the way you're living right now, is 70 a lot of time? Okay, let's just say you were 3 years old when you were carried off into captivity, okay? And let's say here you are in Milton, Florida, okay? But really, you're from Texas. You're not from Florida, you're from Texas. But you've been here, you were brought here in captivity. And now, all of a sudden, the governor of Florida or whatever says, well, you're free to go. You can go back to Texas. All you Texas people can go back to Texas. How many of you are going to go back to Texas? I know one over here might, but because we're Texans. None of you want to go. Wait a minute. But you're Texans. Why don't you want to go back to Texas? And that's exactly what happened. A lot of the Jews stayed in Babylonia. They didn't want to go back. They raised their families there, been there their whole lives. And so you don't have a huge amount of people going back. Well, by the time you then have the Persian Empire, they spread out a bit more, and then along comes Alexander the Great, and he says, I will give you certain privileges if you go and settle these other areas, because he knows that they're going to be loyal to him. And so they're now starting to spread out, and we're going to touch on that a little bit more. Again, God preparing the world. So Alexander dies in 323 B.C. His death was followed by a 20-year power struggle. And that power struggle was divided among 4 of his generals that he had under him. They were divided into 4 territories. These 4 generals went off into 4 different territories, into Greece, into Asia, Egypt, and Syria. And the ones that affected Palestine the most were the Ptolemies, who assumed control of Egypt, and then the Seleucids, and actually it's in reverse order. Seleucids first, and then later the Ptolemies took over that area. So you have 2 different parts of this Greek Empire vying for Palestine. Now the reason this is important is because we're starting to see the prophecy of Daniel. In Daniel, a little bit further, we read that one in 244, but if you go on further in Daniel 8, 5 through 8, and then 8:21, if somebody would please turn to Daniel 8, verse 21, because we're going to read that. It's very important. But in Daniel 5 through 8, he gives a little bit more detail, a little bit more focus of what's going to happen with that statue, those different kingdoms that are coming. And he talks about a he-goat. And this he-goat's going to rise to power, and 1 horn would be broken, and then 4 horns would come out of that, 2 being greater than the other 2. This is in Daniel 8, 5 through 8. Well, here we have that prophecy unfolding before our eyes, because we have Alexander the Great, this great horn, and then he dies, and 4 come out of that, and so it's coming through. Now, what's really interesting to me, and I love this, and I could talk about this for hours, is what it says in verse 21. What does verse 21 say? 8:21.
Is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king.
What kingdom did he say? Is the king of what? Greece. Here we have this prophet before Persia even comes into the picture. Persia's not even into the picture yet. And we have this prophet that's talking about a kingdom after that. Folks, do you realize how important that is? And then what really gets me excited is, did you know that there's portions of Daniel that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which help prove that there was a, real quick, I get off on side tangents, stuff like this, but there's these group of people that came out in the late 1800s, and they were called higher critics, higher criticism, and they had all kinds of reasons to basically not believe the Bible. And they said things like that the Hittites didn't exist. And, well, a few years later, they find a library. Not only did the Hittites exist, but they had an extensive law and culture and everything else. Same thing with the prophecies of Daniel and Isaiah. They tried to go through and discount those, saying, well, they were written after the fact. He went back, and somebody went back and edited this to make it... Well, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that, which were dated before these people, and therefore it proves that Daniel, just like Isaiah, prophesied about Cyrus. Now we have Daniel prophesying about Greece. And so it just proves the truth of God's Word and His prophecies. So again, these prophecies are playing out, and we have now these different kings that are taking over, and things are changing in Palestine. Now, one of the big things about the Grecian Empire was that they had, one of their key areas was in Alexandria, Egypt. And have any of you ever heard of the Great Alexandrian Library? It was massive, and they believe that they collected a lot of the world's greatest books of history and a lot of the documents that, wow, we wish we had today. In fact, there's some people believe that the original manuscripts, some of the original manuscripts of the Bible were in the Alexandrian Library. Well, what happened to the Alexandrian Library, if you know history? It burned. It burned. And I believe that's part of God's wisdom. If there were originals, let's say that the actual written copy that Matthew wrote was there, or even these letters that Paul wrote, his hand. If we had those today, brethren, what would happen with those things? What do you think would happen with those if we had those actual written copies, or written originals? They would worship those. And so I believe it shows God's wisdom that we don't have those originals, that we have proof. We know that what we have is true. Going back to those Dead Sea Scrolls, you can look at the book of Isaiah. The Dead Sea Scrolls go back and they show that not one single word has changed in over 2,000 years, more than that really. And so it shows us that the truth that we have is the same that was the day it was written. I'm going to say this real quick because we're going to quickly run out of time. I'm trying to cover 400 years in 45 minutes. Not going to happen. So I'm going to do the best I can. But I believe between this one and the next class, we will cover the entire intertestamental period. And then this third class, we will finally start with the text of the gospel account of the life of Christ. So during this time, we have the development of, as I mentioned, this single universal language, the Greek language. And it was called, in this case, called the Koine Greek. Koine is a word that means common. So the common Greek. Do you realize there is a common English and then a formal English? Yeah, exactly, because we have words that we use that we wouldn't typically write if we're writing a formal letter. And then it goes even further into oblivion if you start including texting and stuff like that and some of the LOLs and things like that we have that we've invented words. So this was the common language, as if we speak. And that's what was written. And I love Jack's explanation last week when he was talking about how the Greek was written. And they would be writing a word. There wouldn't be a hyphen or anything else. They just start on the next line. And you can see it right there. These are all capital letters. And so it just goes, and stops, and starts over, and goes, and stops, and starts over. You can read this today if you want, if you understand and read Greek. Or even if you don't, there's ways of doing it. They have Bibles that are printed in the Greek language. You can also get them in your Bible programs, the different search programs that we have. You can find them online. So here is this text. This is John, and here it is written out so you can actually read it with the punctuation and everything included. If you don't read Greek, they also have a thing called the interlinear, where they take it and they put the English word with the Greek word, what it is, and everything else. But you need to understand, think about Spanish. Some of you might know a little bit about Spanish. You know how they don't say the White House. They say the house white. Well, Greek is the same way. So the words are not going to be in the same order as English. But if you can just understand that and read it, you can say, okay, that's what they're saying. And it is enlightening a lot of time to be able to read what the actual word was that was used, that was translated in different ways. That's why we always go back to the Greek many times to help us understand what was the writer trying to say, and according to how the word is translated. All right, we have just, has any of the bells rung yet? Where are we at on time? Just a couple of minutes. All right, so real fast, I'm just going to touch on this. During this time of the Greek period and those kings that we talked about, the generals that split off into the 4 different kingdoms, we have under that one, the Seleucids. This is in the area of Palestine. They're the ones who divided Palestine into the different providences that we see in the time of Christ. Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Perea, and Trachonitis. And so these are where some of those names come from and the influences that we have by the time we get to the New Testament. Antiochus III was one of these Seleucids. He was a pretty decent guy. He lowered taxes, granted subventions to the temple, let the Jews live according to the law of their forefathers. And this is written, we know this because Josephus wrote about that historian I was telling you about. But his son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, hated the Jews, and in this period became one of the most cruel. And so from this point, we have this son, Epiphanes, who now again is going to start, we're going to start to see fulfillment of more prophecies that took place in Daniel. Was that the last bell? Was that the end of class? All right. So that's where we'll pick up next week, and we should be able to finish this intertestamental period. And we're going to put all of this together before we start studying the life of Christ. And so you will now understand where all of these things came from and why Jesus talks about the things that he does, where these people like the Pharisees and Sadducees come from, and things like that. So I hope it's been an informative class for you, and we'll see you next week. Please stay for worship.